Welcome, everybody. This is Doug Cook. I'm your host for tonight. I'm the Education Events Coordinator for NOFA Mass. Along with me is Carol Roselle, our Education Director, Grant Administrator, and Soil Carbon Coordinator. Welcome to beautiful, bountiful Hedges with Connor Stedman and Curtis Dragon. First, I'd like to thank all of the NOFA Mass staff and board members who have made this event possible. Grant support for tonight's event comes from New England Biolabs Foundation, and it is a part of a series of integrated educational programming this year focused on diversified hedgerows as a practice for supporting soil carbon sequestration and reconnecting ecosystems in our region, specifically the Essex County in Massachusetts. You can find a podcast with Connor up on our NOFA Mass podcast, and our winter conference workshops, which will be made available soon, are going to be on our YouTube channel. You'll find a workshop from Connor on hedgerows, specifically in the agricultural context. And most importantly, we want to thank you, the viewers and listeners, especially our members who make our education and advocacy work possible. So I'm happy to introduce our presenter, Connor Stedman, who is an ecological designer, a farm business planner and educator based in Hatfield, Massachusetts. As a principal at Appleseed Permaculture, he works with farm businesses and organizations around the Northeast, seeking to adopt industry-leading climate mitigating practices with a specialty in agroforestry enterprises and diversified annual perennial operations. He's an instructor at UVM's Innovative Leadership for Sustainability program and holds a MS in ecological planning from the University of Vermont. With that, Connor, it's all yours.
Okie dokes. Thanks very much, Doug. Thanks, Caro. Thanks to all the people in the background who pulled this together who may not be here right now. I'm seeing a lot of good introductions people are making in the chat. So just so people have a feeling for the format here, I'm gonna present for about half an hour, and then good Mr. Curtis is gonna present for about half an hour, getting into a little more detail about design patterns and applications in the landscape. And then we're gonna try to take a whole bunch of questions because people's questions and situations are so specific. And that's really, the answer to a lot of questions is gonna be, it depends. But hopefully what we can dig into is what it depends on. And so, yeah, this has been a fun series of conversations about hedgerows and kind of the retreeing and the diversifying of a lot of the landscapes that we've ended up with through history. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and we will, cross our fingers, knock on wood, throw salt over our shoulder, and hope that the giant metal cables under the Atlantic Ocean make this possible. All right, so is that visible to you all? Very good. Okay, let's give it a shot. Okay, so I think maybe some people here may have come to my workshop at the winter conference, but probably most of you did not. That was a workshop focused on hedgerows and other agroforestry strategies in agriculture, adding working trees to farm landscapes. And the focus here is a little different. The focus here is on hedgerows in a wide variety of landscape situations. So I am, as Doug kindly said, I am an ecological designer and a farm business planner. And farm business planning requires ecological design, and ecological design on a commercial landscape requires business planning. So, and really, I would argue that it requires some of the thinking of business planning when we're doing it in a residential landscape also, in terms of energy in and energy out, and in terms of being able to evaluate the kind of success and purpose of what we're trying to do. So, I'm going to not pause for questions in this first half hour. I'm going to roll through a almost TED Talk-like little series of ideas that I want to present you with. So buckle your seatbelts, strap into your horses, and collect your questions along the way. You can just kind of pick them like wildflowers along the trail and have a nice bouquet when we get to the Q&A at the end. So, okay, so I want to just locate hedgerows within this larger topic of agroforestry. which is agroforestry is a word that was coined in the 20th century, kind of parallel with the science of agroecology, which is agroecology is a scientific discipline that is led by and in continual kind of reference to and relationship to what is talked about as peasant farming movements around the world, and people in the global south especially. And agroforestry and agroecology both kind of emerged as a way to validate in the academy what people were already doing and have been for thousands and thousands of years. So in a modern sense, what we're talking about with agroforestry is about trees on farms, trees in agriculture, but a lot of these systems have applications in the non-commercial landscape. They have applications in neighborhoods. They have applications in the residential landscape. They have applications in educational settings. And so these are just some ideas here about what we're trying to do, why we would consider using agroforestry, why we would consider diversifying our ecosystems like this. There's the recognition of whole living systems, and that moves into the recognition that a lot of the living systems of our landscapes have been intensely fragmented and interrupted by our current economic system, by what markets have been willing to value and not willing to value. And so the developing whole living systems rather than sort of a mechanical view of the natural world is the starting point for a lot of this. And a lot of what we take direction from in this process is about intensifying photosynthesis. It's about creating a three-dimensional cultivated or landscape, or a three-dimensional landscape that is also in partnership with wild ecosystems. A lot of the very modern and post-disturbance, both agricultural and kind of residential landscapes we have, they kind of have, they have hard edges between crop fields or lawns and the edge of the forest. And so this intensification of photosynthesis means growing in layers. And that layering means more complexity. It means then diversifying the agroecosystem that we're operating in. So intensification and diversification is what a lot of this means. And it's also about perennializing the landscape. And part of why we want to do that is because of this. So this is data from the Project Drawdown, the kind of global review of climate solutions. This was put together by Eric Tonesmeyer, my good friend, and visualized by Raptor Ferguson, another good friend. And what this is showing basically is that of all the agricultural practices that you could call carbon farming, by the ones that store by far the most carbon per hectare or per unit area are the tree-based practices. So in humid climates, if we're talking about carbon sequestration and the real potential of carbon sequestration, we're talking about using woody perennials. Now that's not as true in semi-arid and arid climates because of water competition. So if you're calling in from a semi-arid or arid climate, there's a whole other layer of water availability analysis that you have to do to make sense of how these systems work. But on a global sense, retreeing the world is a lot of what this is motivated by. But it's really important to recognize that a lot of the big proposals around tree planting as a climate solution are taking a very mechanical paradigm view of how to do that. So they're proposing, large monoculture plantations in ways that are not adapted to site and not adapted to local climate and not necessarily even implemented by people who know how to plant trees. So there's a lot that we have to work on around the details of how to make tree planting actually work and store the carbon that it's being promised to store. So I just want to take a little quick run through a tiny bit of hedgerow history. And if you want to dig into more of this, we talked about this a lot on the podcast episode, really digging into issues around hedgerows and empire. And so, but I just want to point out this image in the upper left here. There's all of this amazing, there was this era of just beautiful illustrative artwork in what we think of as the Middle Ages and even the Dark Ages in Europe. And there are just these incredible images of agricultural life throughout that iconography. And so I love this one because I don't know if you can see what this is showing, but it is showing people planting trees and laying a hedge. And so people are planting trees, people are cultivating the earth and planting trees into the cultivated earth, and then they are actually making a living woven hedge out of living growing stems. And that process called of hedge laying that involves the horticultural practice of pleaching is a really ancient thing in not just Europe, but a lot of other parts of the world too, of making these living fences. So this is just one image of many from older periods of history that show how people have used trees in their surroundings. But what's significant is that, you know, part of what isn't always recognized about the way feudalism worked is that feudalism depended on large areas of commonly managed land. And that's not to say that feudalism wasn't based on tremendous oppression of, you know, in a societal caste system. It certainly was, but it had within it these pockets of communalism and these pockets and processes of commons and commoning. And those common forests and woodlands and common hedgerows were places where people would pasture livestock. They were places where people would cut tree hay. They would cut perennial fodder that way they would store for the winter or feed their animals right off the trees. They would harvest nuts and fruit. And a lot of the things that kind of modern permaculture and ecological design has been trying to recreate. Were done not on the scale of an individual home or backyard, but they were done on this much larger scale of the commons. And so the privatization of the commons, the enclosure of the commons through land sales, is one of the really big elements of European history. And that process of taking something that was held and managed in common and turning it into private property is, in a sense, one of the big processes of colonialism around the world, of taking resources from communities and turning them into something that can be privately owned. So that process is what has led to, if you follow all the deeds and documents and land grants, that process is what has led to our private property lines that we have now. And that process also created a shrinking of hedgerows. It created a shrinking of those wild common forests down into things like you see on the right, where you have kind of single tree rows that are sort of all that remain of those older, larger belts of common land. And for a number of historical reasons and economic reasons and cosmological reasons, that process of commoning was largely not brought to North America by European settlers. Instead, the indigenous processes of commoning that were happening here were, you know, significantly interrupted and prevented from continuing in the ways that they might have sought to continue. And hedgerow, I mean, really diverse hedgerow practices did not translate into North America for the most part. And a lot of the indigenous tree and forest management practices were severely interrupted by that same process. So then we get into the Dust Bowl. And one of the big elements of hedgerow history in North America is the Civilian Conservation Corps, because this was an instance where in a jobs program to counteract the Great Depression and also to counteract the Dust Bowl, the federal government put hundreds of thousands of people to work doing conservation work, but they were doing conservation work in a mechanical paradigm of thinking about landscapes and living things. So it was these single species plantations that were mainly planted with the goals of reducing wind erosion and soil loss. And so the remnants of those hedgerows are all around the Great Plains and Intermountain West to this day. But I think we can even go beyond that historical example and kind of relearn from some of this older history. So just a little image of this place without political boundaries, but you know, as a satellite might see it now. And I just want to, you know, if we had more time, I'd be engaging people in conversation around what they see in this image. But for now, I just want to point out a few things. And one is that, you know, if you think about New England, you know, Northeast present day US, this is a heavily forested landscape. But it is a recently regrown forest that is post-disturbance, and not just one disturbance, but a whole series of forest clearing disturbances that started in the late 1600s and went, you know, reached their zenith in the sheep farming era in a lot of this region in the mid 1800s. And so these are very young forests. And And they're very different. They're very, very ecologically and successionally different than the pre-disturbance forest mosaic of this region. But the second thing to notice is that especially in southern New England, this is a very fragmented landscape of forest. And it's fragmented by cities and towns and suburbs and roads, and that carving of private property lines down smaller and smaller. So, I want to propose that although there's this large carbon stock that exists in the regrowing forests of this region, there's been a significant interruption in a lot of wildlife habitats, in insect population resources, in the below ground soil food web. And there's also a vulnerability of these regrown forests, both to further fragmentation and to some of the accelerating effects of climate change. So I think part of the kind of potential of hedgerow work is about, first and foremost, getting really active in our local ecosystem and really getting involved with our hands in what's happening in the biogeochemical cycles of where we live, what's happening in the water cycle, what's happening in the reproductive populations of pollinators and native insects, what's happening in the questions of connectivity. And I will just say that from the research, I've looked a lot into the insect population collapse research, because it's obviously very concerning. And one of the big things about insect populations and insect habitat in the residential landscape, especially in urban and suburban landscapes, the biggest variable about how the quality of your backyard for insect habitat is what your neighbors are doing. That makes a bigger difference for your yard than anything you do in your yard, because the reproductive ranges of so many of these insects are bigger than our single backyard, right? So I want to suggest that even as we think about, okay, what's the access to land I have, what are the options available to me, that we kind of push our minds a little past private property boundaries and start to think about what would it be like to actually take on some of these things collectively. What would it be like to work on a neighborhood scale, even a small watershed scale? And just one quick image of that from Maryland in the Chesapeake watershed. Maybe some people here are from there. There's actually a huge amount of money available there for cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay, and from nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. And a lot of the most successful and funded projects there are actually where you have a whole series of landowners who agree to work together to do a stream restoration collectively. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, if we put our 6 properties together, we've got half a mile to a mile of this stream corridor that can be restored. That's then a really kind of hydrologically significant project at that scale. And so I think sometimes we have to think on that level of what can we do together, and and that requires the very scary thought of organizing and making friends with our neighbors and doing things together, which there's a lot of US or individualism that gets in the way of that, and maybe in some ways especially in New England. So but I think it'll probably be required to survive the coming century of what climate change is heading us towards. So I want to say a few things about planting trees. And I'm not going to get into the kind of methods of planting trees, but I want to suggest that there are 3 types of tree planting strategies. And if you were at my NOFA workshop, we went into this a lot more, but really broadly, those types are divided by how much the trees cost. So there are really, really cheap perennial planting strategies that I'm calling type 3 tree planting, where you're spending like $2.50 or less per individual plant. And these are the big scale reforestation and conservation planting approaches. You're getting trees from conservation nurseries. And their survival is not 100%. In fact, it's quite a bit lower than 100%. And that's not the point. The point is mass coverage and diversity. Then there's these type 2 plantings. And this is often where hedgerows lie, is that a lot of agroforestry techniques fall into this type 2 planting approach, where we're investing more in the individual plant material, and we're actually starting to invest a little bit in protecting it from animals. And that's one of the big dividing lines here, is whether you're investing in vole and deer protection or not as you plant it. And then the type 1 is there's a lot of investment in the survival of individual plants. And this is often where, kind of higher quality residential landscaping lies. And it's also where more managed agricultural systems lie: orchards, vineyards, high management forest gardens. And so, this is where you're really aiming for close to 100% survival of what you plant. So I just wanted to give the idea that there's actually a range of paths we can take in terms of the nature of investment being made. And not all of them look like the heavily managed landscape, but also not all of them look like just planting 1,000 trees and hoping a few of them live. So just to give you an idea that there is a design process that can be used in designing hedgerows, and go into this a lot more in courses on ecological design or workshops on that focus specifically. But just to suggest that your goals for the hedgerow are of great importance, and it's actually very valuable to get clear about what you're trying to accomplish through a hedgerow planting. So, for instance, both what are you trying to achieve and what will help you evaluate whether it's working or not. What are some of the indicators? And so, even some of this kind of ecological science thinking around indicator monitoring can actually help even at the scale of a home or a backyard or a neighborhood, whether our environmental projects are working or not. So for instance, our goals might be we're trying to decrease wind impacts. We're trying to play some of the role of a windbreak. They might be that we're trying to decrease nutrient and sediment runoff into a local waterway, which a dense perennial planting can be very effective at. Especially when combined with earthworks. It might be that we're trying to make a significant improvement in insect and bird habitat. And it also might be that we're trying to produce a harvestable crop of some kind, whether that's food or not. Now, there are situations where you can do all 4 of these at the same time. And you sometimes even can achieve many more things beyond this. There might be goals around aesthetics, around the sense and experience of the land that you're working on. But it's very helpful to know what those goals are. And if you're saying, I want to do it all, that's going to really narrow what your options are. That's going to narrow your options for what you're doing and how you can achieve it. So it's really helpful to know what's really important here. And then, another question is, what are the major restraints and considerations that you'll need to focus on in developing your design? And so, for instance, the characteristics of your site are hugely important for this. And we're going to hear a lot more about that from Curtis, so looking at different landscape scenarios for hedgerow work. And also what plants and trees are available to you. And sometimes, for instance, there have been shortages of a lot of plant material during the pandemic, partly because of increased demand and also because of increased cost of production. So, there's a property I'm trying to find medlars for right now, and I can't find any. They're sold out at the nurseries that I usually use, and it's not even that deep into the winter yet. So so sometimes you're really shaped by what plants you can get a hold of at the quantities that you're trying to get a hold of them, especially for larger plantings. And then cost is often a really big determinative factor. So, being really clear about what the goals are that you're trying to achieve, and also being really clear about what the constraints and considerations that you're going to need to be guided by. This goes a long way towards clarifying what a design has to look like. And in a really short sense, this is what we engage with in a professional process of landscape design. I want to just show a few design inspirations. So these are patterns of hedgerows that we might take inspiration from in our more designed hedgerows. So this is often what kind of wild hedgerows look like, right? At the edge of fields. They are a remnant of some trees that were left probably as a windbreak or a field break marker, but they've often grown in with a lot of density near the ground. And so, these hedgerows, they're great for storing carbon. They're great for insect habitat. They often host a lot of introduced and invasive species. They can be pretty difficult to harvest from. There are ways to integrate livestock into these and use them as a fodder bank. There's a lot we can do with these. This sometimes is a model, sometimes is an inspiration for our designed hedgerows, and sometimes it's not, especially if harvesting crops or other products from it is an important goal. So, here's a much simpler and more sort of agricultural version of that same thing. So these are alley cropping systems here, where it's a much lower level of diversity, often just 1 or 2 species in a narrow alley. And it's designed such that all of the trees can be accessed for harvest because they're actually producing, timber, or they're producing fruit or nuts. or they're planted as a denser hedge and they're actually being used for shade or fodder for animals. But the idea that you have these blocks of something else in between these hedgerow alleys. And so alley cropping is a kind of rapidly developing field of agriculture in the US. It's used a lot in other parts of the world, especially the tropics. So now this is a different one, and I just wanted to show you this one, even though it's totally herbaceous, because it really illustrates the power of these wild strips, okay, and these unmanaged areas of land for insect habitat. So, for instance, it is a well-recognized pesticide use reduction practice to include what are called prairie strips in an agricultural field. And the reason for that is that the habitat that the prairie strips create for the predator insects of the agricultural pests is such that it actually reduces the need for pesticides. So just from that alone, you can tell how significant these wild strips are for insect habitat. And so you can easily imagine adding woody species to something like this, and making a hedgerow with a big focus on herbaceous flower production. So these are called prairie strips. They're also called meadow strips. And then, here's a different version of that. So these are rain gardens here. These are infiltration basins that are actually, their main purpose is to remediate runoff from the road. And so they're designed with the slope and angle of the road so that stormwater runoff goes into these basins and not into a storm drain. But you can see that they're multifunctioning as incredible pollinator habitat. So again, adding woody species to this concept allows you to have a hedgerow in a wet area or in a basin that's collecting water, that can be doing a lot of ecological function work in your landscape at the same time. This is a very different example. So this is a perennial market garden from Mexico. So this is an example of tropical agroforestry as a commercial farming practice. And there are some elements of syntropic agriculture in this image, which is a very high biomass producing form of agroforestry in the tropics. But the idea here is to show the fact that you can actually have multiple layers of agricultural production in the same space. You can have a highly food productive hedgerow, but the key to this image and why I wanted to show you this is to notice the spacing of the trees in this image. They are spaced widely enough apart that you can actually prune and harvest from them. And that's one of the big things if you're trying to really produce a crop from a hedgerow, you need to think about spacing and you need to think about harvesting and maintenance access. And often they become dense enough that they have to be treated more as a wild planting and less as an agricultural planting. So those are just tensions to balance in the design you end up with. This is a fodder bank. So this is an instance of a hedgerow being grown particularly for animal fodder. And this is a totally widespread practice all around the world, especially again in the humid tropics, where you have these small land holdings that support livestock as well as crop production. And often there's a lot of perennial fodder production as part of that. So again, you can basically create a 3D pasture where you have grazing on the ground, and then you also have, you have fodder being grown above ground, stored or browsed on like this. So again, maybe you have some home livestock, maybe the quote livestock that you're using are honeybees and you're designing the bank essentially as honeybee fodder. And now lastly, I want to just share a little bit more about spacing, because this is one of the biggest questions in hedgerow design, is how far apart the plants are spaced from each other. And I want to give you a few different examples of spacing to start to think about how they might relate to the goals you have and the constraints that you're experiencing. And then Curtis is going to take us on a big old tour of different landscape situations that you might encounter and how some different approaches to landscape design can fit those situations. So you can hold all this in your mind as you're seeing some of Curtis's examples. So again, back to the kind of wild spacing of a sort of unmanaged hedgerow at the edge of a field. Again, high insect habitat, high carbon, low maintenance, low production, and low accessibility, right? So again, it's often not possible to meet all goals in one system on one site. Now, this is an example of a layout where harvest access has been maximized. So here, in this case, we have elderberries in the background and indigo in the front. And what I think you can notice here in the way these plants are spaced is that you can walk through and access any of the shrubs in the back and also prune and harvest from any of the herbaceous perennials in the front. And so this is a wider spacing than we sometimes imagine as a hedgerow. But again, this is more like what the tropical market garden looks like, with all the plants being able to be fully utilized. And also in our climate where we don't have a lot of economic products that grow in full shade, we often have to use wider spacing if we're kind of fully utilizing photosynthesis. So then this is an example, this is more of an agricultural example. This is single species, single row. And this is an elderberry hedge that's basically taking up the space of a single row of, say, brambles or grapes or another agricultural product. And the thing about this, you see there's a little bit of a denser spacing between the individuals in the row, but it's fully accessible from both sides still. So, for species that don't need a lot of pruning, this can be a good way to have a lot of coverage and still use a lot of production. Elderberries in this setup will still not produce as much per plant as they would if they had their full crown space to grow into. But they also will have marginally less weed pressure in this layout than they will if they have more spacing. And I will say that if you're trying to do woody crop production in a hedgerow layout, one of the biggest management issues is woody weeding. It's weeding out tree seedlings that are establishing because you're not regularly mowing the space right around the trees. So now here's an example of a multi-species denser alley. We're not looking so much at the trees in the back of this image, but we're looking on the kind of lower foreground. You can see currants in here and raspberries and also some horseradish and a number of different perennial species. So this is kind of a classic dense kind of permaculture style hedge. And what's notable about this is that you have a lot of ground cover. You're going to minimize weed competition. It's accessible from both sides, but the interior of this hedgerow is not very accessible. So you're not going to get full fruiting production or access from all the fruiting species, but the herbaceous species, if you're digging them, the root, like with dock, or if you don't intend to harvest them below ground, like comfrey, then those can kind of reach their full production in this kind of system. So this is a little bit of a moving in the direction of that wild hedgerow style, and it's going for high diversity, more of a polyculture, like Curtis is going to talk some about. So just to have in your mind that there are trade-offs between these different emphases. There are trade-offs between accessibility, between management considerations and production, and then also some of the ecological effects. If you're trying to remediate water runoff and nutrient pollution through a hedgerow, you want high density planting because you want a lot of root biomass and you want a lot of above ground biomass. Versus and you also want really high density if you're growing for animal fodder, or if you're trying to really maximize flowering production for insects. But a lot of the variables there are actually about what the species are that you're planting, not just their density and growth. So there's a lot to think about here. There's a lot to kind of game out and play with on paper, and then or try out on the landscape. And the good news is that a lot of perennial plants, if you don't like where you put them, you can move them within the first year. There's a few trees where you don't want to do that because they put down a deep taproot, but for the most part, you can move things. So don't be too scared about trying some things if you end up deciding you want to move something. It's not as ideal for the plant as leaving it be, but some of these plantings are not as permanent as they may initially look. And that's especially true of the species that propagate themselves easily vegetatively, like a lot of these currants, like a lot of the herbaceous perennials. There's a little more flexibility to move things around and try than we might realize sometimes. And actually, if you read our good friend's book Paradise Lot about the kind of highly diverse backyard forest garden in Holyoke, that's something they talk about, is actually changing the design year over year and moving things around based on things they tried they didn't end up liking, and then trying something new. So there is space to play like that. So I think I'm hitting my half-hour mark here, and I want to pass it over to Curtis to take us through some landscape scenarios.
Thanks, Connor, for all that great information. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Curtis Dragon. Excuse me. Curtis Dragon has been a designer, is the founder of Earth Landscape, and has been a designer for over 35 years in creating sustainable landscape solutions with organic products. Curtis is a certified arborist, horticulturalist, and an accredited organic land care professional, and providing natural landscape design and installation, and as a plant health care practitioner. He holds an associate in applied science, horticulture, and is based in Salem, Massachusetts. Thanks, Curtis.
Great. Okay. So can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm just going to kind of start off with a quick overview, and I've got some slides that will kind of state, what I'll be saying and so forth. But this is kind of a good example to start off with. This is one of our clients in Marblehead. Most of my work is in Essex County. That's what this is about, but of course it could be related to anywhere in our area. And so this is a good example of a hedge that's in front, but then behind it, it's broken up a little bit more with other shrubbery, and the same thing in the back. And the reason for this, it would be an example of it's a driveway, a circular driveway, and it kind of breaks it all up and breaks the view up from across the street. So that's kind of nice. And then it opens up into lawns along the side. And then in the back, on the other side in front of the house, it has another hedgerow as well. So it's kind of a little bit diverse there, showing that it's broken up. So this is first prompt from my colleague Jimmy Kanazer and myself from Full Circle Earth, and myself, Earth Landscape. So that's how it prompt. Jimmy was prompt to ask me to do it, and we do a lot of work together. So my overview is, what is the land care scope? Well, we're trying to grow a diversified hedge as opposed to a standard hedge, with new hedges when we're planting, and to be more diverse in our planting for habitats, for more butterflies and bees and birds and other wildlife. Again, mostly Essex County examples, but again, it could go anywhere in New England. And so that's very useful. And so what's my goals is to show, so the first thing I'll do is show existing hedgerows, which are considered monolithic, one type of hedgerows, mostly for privacy. And then the second part, I'll be promoting hedgerows plantings with the explanations for new sites and specific designs, and explanations put together, with my shared documents. And so the specifications that we're starting out with were new site designs as opposed to existing. So when you have an opportunity to plant new ones, to think differently than just planting the standard monolithic plantings. And then one of the things that we say, it's a polyculture hedgerow. So what that means is that you're really just using a diverse set of plants. You're not just using one type of plant. And it's more diverse, and also it's less likely to have problems if it gets attacked from an insect or a disease, or a harsh winter or something like that. Sometimes we've been seeing it on our standard Arborvitaes, there's been a lot of burn back if they're not protected sometimes, and it's hard to get those to get reestablished because you have to pull it out and put in a new one if it really gets damaged back badly. And then again, the polycultural hedgerows consist of different plant species planted together, providing more benefit than just the privacy screen, obviously. And the reason for that is you're getting flowers and more diverse plantings that will attract different types of wildlife. Also, for different color intonations, for intonations in with the plant themselves, the different colors of greens or different hues, different other types of flowering, like yellows and reds. And then they also provide other functioning, like again, for the wildlife, nectar for butterflies, food beneficial insects, berries, of course, seeds, nesting sites, pollinators for bees. So basically, you're changing your concept, and it's just for all general wildlife. We see a lot of bird nests in a lot of these new ones. All right, so now I'll kind of start going into what was the standard hedgerow. So this is a row of Canadian hemlocks dividing one property to another. Again, there's a tennis court behind this property over here. They have a lawn, and of course that gives them privacy. But of course you can see it's high maintenance. You've got to trim that a few times, 2 or 3 times a year. And then if any disease or anything happens to that, like of course we get a lot of the woolly adelgid now, and if it's not treated, this could fail. And so we would promote to do it a little bit more diverse and let it grow in that way. Another one of our standards is Privet Hedge. These are newly hedges that were kind of grown, but eventually you would kind of trim those and they would become what we call almost like a stove top, where you would trim the angles on either side, and then the top a little bit narrower so that it will shed the snow during the winter times. And I'll have an example of that later on. But that's a standard hedge using one monolithic type of plant and using it over and over again. And then here's another one that everybody knows is Arborvitaes. So these look like they're emerald and green Arborvitaes, and they plant them together really tightly like this. Normally we wouldn't plant them so close together, but of course they want to get privacy right away. And what does that do? That forces them to grow upwards a little bit faster than growing out widewards, so that they're getting instant privacy screen. And so as the years go by, that would overtake that fence. That fence is a 6-foot fence, and you can see they're already up 6 foot. And you can see that new top growth that's on there. That's about a year's growth from that top of the fence to the top of that. So you got about a good 8 inches a year that they're growing into that. And that's why people plant these, is to kind of get that diverse planting, so that they can have their privacy from their neighbors. Here's another one that's kind of on the corner of a property. It was built up first, and then the Arborvitaes were put in. And so when the children were playing in the yard or something like that, they would have privacy. Of course, the whole backyard is open, so they play a lot on the lawn there. And then in the back, it doesn't show it in this one, but then there's a whole bunch of wildlife plantings that gives them privacy from the other neighbors. And also you could see on the left over here as well, just a natural hedgerow, I would call it. Looks like there's some hemlocks in there, and some other types of evergreens as well. And so that was probably just planted by default without that in mind. And then they got their privacy from that. So then here's some boxwood. So that's another mainstay that they use a lot. It's easy to keep, maintain, to shear, and maintain it. They trim that maybe once or twice a year, and that's it. Forget about it. And that would give them a little bit of privacy from the upper lawn to the lower lawn, as you can see going into the backyard, or just as a formal type of planting. The English non-planting is how we started with our plantings, and that's what people would have done is planted these in rows like that as a formal planting to define one area to another in the yard. So here's where we're starting a little bit with trying to get away with just that monolithic type of planting. We have the standard boxwood, but then we've put an upright opal holly here, and then we have a rhododendron in the back, another couple of rhododendrons, maybe a PGM rhododendron, and then we broke it up where the driveway entrances with a dogwood. And so this is the kind of starting that idea of changing it from just that monolithic type and breaking it up a little bit more, rather than just have the hedge go all the way. Instead of where this holly is, they would have had them all go there. And then this is also where the other corner of the house is, so it breaks up the corner of the other house, so other end of the house. So that is a good design feature as well. Breaking up that corner. So that's very helpful. And then the dogwood, of course, is going to flower, and then that will attract insects, for the flowering, and plus the beauty of that, whether it's a pink flowering dogwood or the white Connors Cooser dogwood. So that's starting the process of showing how we would break up that monolithic planting. So here's another idea of trees as a hedgerow. Some of these plantings are in like Wenham, for instance, and just beyond these trees is the main street. And this is the driveway coming up to the house. There'll be another picture showing where the house is. And so the trees were planted along this side, as well as to get privacy from the neighbors and from the street. Also, what it does too is give you a lot of noise reduction, and that helps out a lot as well. So this is that same property. So where those were was on this side over here. This was the driveway coming down. Now this is in the property looking forward. And then another example is between the two properties. So another example is they planted some trees here. You can see there's 3 trees here in between the properties. And then again, in between the properties where this hill was, they put another hedgerow, and they have some junipers here. This would have been, I think, burning bush maybe, Japanese maple in the back over here. So that kind of broke up the hill. So when the builder built these, by having this hill here, that gave a little bit of privacy, plus with the trees in between the two houses to give you a little bit of privacy, which is kind of nice between your neighbors. So this is looking back out to the street. On the left was with the other picture that I showed you. So this is that same house now, where they put more of a diverse planting again to get some privacy from the street. So you can see we got a Colorado blue spruce here. You got some maple trees, birch tree over here, multi-stem birch tree, and then you got some junipers for hedges that low growing. So that will give them that privacy that they're looking for, plus that noise reduction for when the cars are going by. And it does make a difference when you're in the property. You can tell when a car's going by, obviously, but it's not so loud and intruding into the property. Gives you a little bit of privacy. So here's another one where it starts with changing from what a typical yew or hemlock or arborvitae. Inkberry is a good plant to use as a hedge. It's our native planting. It has the blackberries that will be bird feeders. And so as an example, what we'll promote later on is probably breaking this up a little bit. And changing it with other species, maybe putting some PGM rhododendrons in between there for some forsythia. I'll show some examples of that as well. But this is a good break for where the deck is, and before you get into the lawn. The other thing too that we're promoting is widening the bed instead of having so much lawn. That's another trend is to reduce our lawns. And so what could possibly happen is we could cut another bed in here and put a perennial planting in there. I'll show some other examples of that as well. So this is going back to that first slide, just taking kind of a side view from that, where you can see you kind of have the hedge here. You've got the trees on either side banking it, and then you got the driveway coming in over here, and the other and the driveway coming over there, which kind of breaks it up. And as you can see from this angle, it does give you a little bit of privacy. And I'll also, towards the end in the design, I'll talk about fertilizing, because as an example would be this beech that's in the back. You can't see it in here, but in other presentations, there's another beech over here that's the neighbors, and this beech is fluorescent looking, and the other beech is kind of dull looking, just as an example when we talk about fertilizer. And that's because my colleague and I, we both use organic fertilizer with the kelp and the fish and compost, and that's what makes the difference in the vibrant colors and the health of the plants as well. So here's another planting where we broke up the backyard. This would have been, again, you've got some Canadian hemlocks over here, and then some smaller, you got a burning bush over here, and then the trees out to the street over here. And so this was on a wetlands. And so we got permission to kind of break it up and not make it so monolithic again. And so the people wanted to have a patio and some area, private areas for a sitting area. Their deck is right here. The cellar door from the deck is here, and there's a deck on the side. And so now we're able to put some grasses in there, some daisies in there, and break it up, and so they get some color. And of course, this is again attracting a lot of insects and pollinators and bees, and it helps the overall land value as well. And then of course it doesn't show it here, but down in the lower left hand, it's all wetlands down in there. So we were able to get permission to do that because we were enhancing that, and then we enhanced the wetlands as well. And also what these hedgerows do and plantings is they absorb all the water pollutants too. So if there's any pollutants that are going in there, the soil food web will assimilate all that and purify the water on its way down to purifying it for the aquifer. So here's another prime example where you would normally put the hedges in there. So you can see a few standard hedges. You get some rhododendrons here, some mugo pines over there, and then the perennials. This is a good example of why you would want to break that up. And so another reason is that during the winter, all this it gets cut down. And it's easy maintained. And then during the summertime, they get a flurry of wildlife into here, mainly pollinators and also, the backdrop here. So they've got this perennial hedge here, and then they've got tree plantings and shrub plantings in the back, and that gives them total privacy. As you can see, the house is over here in that area, and it's blocking mostly almost everything. There's only just that one space that's showing over there, going back to that. And so that gives them complete privacy when they're using their pool during the summertime. And then during the wintertime, they pretty much can forget about it because perennials will go dormant. They can just cut those clean to the ground, and they'll come back next year. And that way it's easy for them to maintain it as the time goes by. So this is another idea of perennial plantings instead of regular hedges up against a fence to break up the fence. You get butterfly bush here. And then also what they've got in here is they've got some tomatoes as well growing into here too, some peppers growing in. So they've kind of mixed in with that so that they can get some vegetables out of it as well. So that's another idea, is the, making it so that you can get some food out of it as well. And so they spend a lot of time on this patio here, and then they'll just pick what they, what's when something's ripe, and they have a good little spot there. So here's another traditional way. There's a tennis court in Hamilton, and you can see these rows of, they look like boxwoods, and they're just a smaller variety, just to break up the difference between the tennis court and the lawn, so that mainly when the lawnmower guys come, they don't go into the post. You can see the posts are nearly falling down. So this protects from that. I imagine that these are much higher now, but that would be kind of a standard planting. Now this one's in front of my house here. And when we bought this house, we had mainly this privet hedge here. And then what we did is, I'll show another picture of it. We planted other plants around to break it up. And we put this Bradford pear here as well. Although we don't plant that much anymore. We didn't know about it back about 24 years ago. They were very popular because of the nice white flowers that it's growing. But we don't use these anymore because the fruit is pretty messy and so forth. But it doesn't bother us. It's kind of out in the corner, and when we're parked in the driveway. And then so what we did is we added some plantings behind here. I'll show in another one, and some Pachysandria. So there's really no maintenance, little low maintenance. The only thing we do is trim it once a year. And this has been here since the house, so it can show how old these hedgerows can grow and live. So an example is that our house is about 120 years old now. And so that hedgerow was planted when the house was there. So it's been there for well over 120 years. And the previous people, all they did was trim it once a year. And then we added other plantings around the whole house just to break it up a little bit and get some interest in there. So here's another idea. Again, when we talk about wetlands, you always have to, keep conservation in mind. And if you're doing anything, you have to go in front of the Conservation Commission. So when these were built, this was part of the idea, is that right down in this hollow down here, there's a culvert under this road, and it's water that's coming in and feeding in and out to this pond here. So you can see that they really are concerned about runoff of pollutants, mainly nitrates and phosphates. So here's a prime example of how a lawn is tilted toward where it would go into waterways, but yet what do we have? We have a low hedgerow with some trees here that will catch any of those excess phosphates and nitrates and absorb it into the bed rather than falling into the pond and or the lake and creating what we know as eutrophication. So eutrophication is when you're getting too much algae growth into a waterway, and it sucks up the oxygen and then creates dead zones. So this is a good example of another reason why we would have a hedgerow, even though this isn't a formal hedgerow. It's perfect for what we want to hear for the necessity of doing that. And this is showing, we all love our lawns, right? So, the massive lawn care business is constantly throwing down nitrates and phosphates down here. And that's what we're trying to do, is promote not doing that or doing less of that. And of course, I've turned this into an organic lawn as well. So we're not putting in so much of the nitrates and phosphates, because you can see if you have a downpour, it's all just going to go right into that lake and then start creating problems. And then, so you got a lot of these U's in the back. And then what it doesn't show is actually the reason why that this hedgerow is planted there when the building was built many years ago is because there's a big drop off here, and he has a little private area, like a beach area where he can sit and near the water and so forth. And even if he wants to take a dip or so forth, he can. There's a set of stairs that comes down the back down here. So that acts as several things. Is it doesn't block his view. So it's a low growing hedgerow, and it makes a definition between the drop off and the downgrade of going down to where the waterway is. And then again, the whole area from here and then going back to this side here, this is where that is catching all those pollutants. So that's one thing that's overlooked a lot, and that's what we're promoting, especially through NOFA, is to use less fertilizers. And how are we doing that? We're doing that by using more compatible fertilizers like compost and compost teas and kelp and fish emulsions and fertilizers that way. So here's just another standard hedgerow. This is one of my neighbors across the street. We had just fixed the lawn here, so we put some salt marsh hay down here, and then I just took a picture here so that I could also show that. It's kind of the off season here, but he has got some forsythia here, PGM rhododendron, and then now on this is kind of the modern idea of what you want to do with hedgerows. You want to break it up with different plantings. So what do we have? We have forsythia, it looks like, Van Hoody spirea, it looks like maybe a purple gem rhododendron here, and another red rhododendron. And so that's kind of the idea. And then of course I get a Mugo pine in the back here. But again, you can see this is the diversity of what's being promoted. I just took this off the internet to show what the diversity is of what you're promoting. and what you'd like to achieve, so that you're getting a little bit more diverse than just that monolithic type. So here's another row of conifers as a hedgerow. Again, you can see the house in the back here, and then this is just giving them some privacy here. And so when this was built, that this row was planted in there. And again, it will deaden the sound as well, give nesting sites. Even though it's not as diverse, it still has a lot of landscape value because it, of the nesting sites, the privacy screen, the absorption of pollutants as well. Of any of the runoffs, because you can see the grade is running off and running down that way. So that's another big benefit that is overlooked a lot, is that when you have these massive beds like this, the roots will grow all the way into the lawn here and start absorbing some of those pollutants. Now, this is more of a formal type of a hedge planting in historic Salem, one of our clients. And so this was planted many years ago, following the historical values of that. So you got the Chinese boxwood here, you got these Hatfield yews in the back over here, and then it's broken up with some hydrangeas, some leucotheriae over here. Again, as you can see, other perennials put into it. So this is really good for the ecology, where when we come into here, there's just a flurry of insect life going in here, and it changes during the seasons as well, but mainly during the summertime, because that's when most of this is flowering. That we do have some of the plants that flower in the fall. But that's the idea. Is the other concept is to try to get spring, summer, and fall types of flowering plants within your planting. And then this is a good example of showing how diverse you can make a hedge grow by incorporating the perennials again. So that's another thing we're promoting. So whenever you did a row, you would always make another bed in front and try to get a row of perennials. It just adds to the benefit tremendously. Then this is just a different shot of it so that you can get the full view of it. And then this goes into another part of the backyard, and there's another very similar type of planting there. All right, so this is more of a commercial type of planting, where they want to get privacy a little bit anyways. This is a veterinarian clinic off of Highland Ave in Salem, and across the street you've got all these condos. So this was planted in there to try to break that up, and yet to still have their sign there so that they could see that. So you got Alberta spruce here. Looks like PGM rhododendron maybe here, Mugo pines in the front, a yew over here. So those are kind of more standard type of plantings, but a little bit more diverse. And then this is kind of the front side of it, where it has a little bit more color into it. And again, remember how we talked about some winter damage. If you plant a monolithic type and you got all kinds of wind over the winter, you'd be cutting out and losing a lot of that. So what we would have done here is just cut this out, opened it up, and that growth would have came back. So that's, taking up that middle island there, and it's serving different things. It's allowing to have their sign over there, the driveway coming through it, and yet when you're inside, you're getting some sense of privacy rather than just being out on the main road like that. Now, this is another concept. This is in the backyard of my house. And so instead of just planting one type of hedges, we broke it up where we have some grasses here. We got lilac, some perennials down in the bottom over here, and butterfly Japanese maple in the back here. And so kind of to the right over here is where we have patio, and then the lawn area. And then I have another hedgerow here of multiple plantings, mainly some trees. I've got a Norway spruce, a upright opal holly over here, and some other over here in the back. I got a maple tree as well on the other side. So planted the whole perimeter of the property to get a little bit of privacy from the neighbors and so forth. Okay, so this is another one in Beverly Farms. And as you can see down here, this is the ocean looking off, and then there's a beach down over here. And this is their driveway and their backyard, their patios off to the right. And so this is a great example of a rhododendron given some privacy. There's another house off to the left over here, and they've got a whole border of plantings down here, and then yet they left the cutout enough where they could still see from their house the ocean and so forth. And then of course it's enclosed back over here with trees and other plantings. They've got some yews here, and the same thing, some yews that are here for a diverse planting. Again, it drops off when it goes down again to a beach over there. So it's the same concept. And so another concept here, when we first took over this property, there was a lot of problems. They had a lot of insect problems. They had a lot of fertilizing problems, and all we did is change the way that they maintained it, really just using compost and compost tea, and using kelp and fish. And again, towards the end, I'll explain how to make it yourself as well. And the same thing with the lawn. That's an organic lawn. And so we changed the turf types. I know we're not talking about that, but as you can see it, we're changing it to tall fescues mostly, it's rather than the Kentucky bluegrasses. And then that way it doesn't need as much water. And so we're morphing things, but you can see the health of it now. And this was only 1 year after. So when you use this kelp and fish and compost tea, it's extraordinary how quickly plants will respond, because you're taking care of the nutrients in the soil food web. You're actually just basically feeding the animals in the soil, which in turn their waste, their poop, is creating nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the 17 elements that all plants need. And we're feeding the 90 elements that the soil needs, which is much, much, much more important. And so that's how we look at things when we come in and do an assessment on a property. So this is another formal.
I was wondering if you have maybe like 1 more minute so we can have time for questions.
Okay, yep, I'll just run through it. So this is just another formal planting in the back, and then it's a little bit more broke up in the back of that. This is in the heart, again, where we put a formal hedge planting, and then we had a more diverse planting in the back over there, and again, broke it up with some perennials over here. And I'll just run through that. So this is the other side of my house of the hedge here. And you can see there's no maintenance here at all except trimming the privet hedge once a year. I'll just run through a few more real quickly. This is just a sitting area in the back of a hotel in Salem. And you can see the more diverse planting. And then this is what we would use to break up a planting. So with a new planting, we would just put winterberry, rhododendron, beauty bush, blue Atlas cedar, eastern red cedar, American arborvitae instead of all American arborvitae. And then this would be the concept of breaking up that hedge. Then I just have 2 more slides. And then this would be another example where you're getting some deciduous plantings, where you get Forsythia rosacearum, smoke bush, northern bayberry, lilac. And then the last one would be, this is how it would look from there. So I think that's the slide. Yeah. Great.
Thank you very much for all that. I'm going to jump right into some of the questions that we got. We got a lot, so sorry for those folks that we don't get to your questions. Just to start, there are some questions about maintenance, and in particular deer browse. And Deb was asking if there are any particular ways to protect your new plantings from deer browse.
Yes, fencing. I really encourage people to invest in deer protection, and I think this is a place where it's really valuable to kind of become aware of our aesthetic preferences and where they're in conflict with the way the landscape actually works. So we share the landscape with mammals, and mammals eat, there's mammals that eat all kinds of things, but there's a whole guild of mammals who eat cambium. They eat the inner bark of trees, and they eat twigs, and they're especially eating them in the winter when they've run out of their higher nutrient density plant food sources. So if you want a landscape where it's kind of like, it's that old builder's triangle, right? Cheap, fast, good. You get 2 of them at most, and sometimes you only get 1. So if you want a landscape where things don't need any deer protection, that means generally you're either planting a much smaller list of species, much smaller list of species, and you're just choosing from those, or you're planting much larger trees and they're much more expensive. So if you want to spend a lot less money and you want to have the full range of species as options, then you are going to want to use deer protection. And so you basically have 2 options for that. So one of them is tree tubes, and so those are the like 5 to 6 foot tall, usually cloudy plastic tubes that are used in conservation plantings. They're very effective. They're probably the lowest cost option on a per unit tree basis, but they don't look great. So again, that's a question of like, what's our relationship to aesthetics versus function? And are there actually places where we can evolve our aesthetic preferences based on this interaction that we're having? And then the other option is individual, well, there's 2 more options. One is individual fencing around each individual woody plant. So when you do that, it's very effective for deer protection, but you also need vole protection then around the base of the woody plant, because the biggest period of vole vulnerability is during the winter in deep snows, when they're in the subnuvial zone below the ground. So so Renee is saying you can plant intentional deer browse on the outside and you prefer it on the inside. Yeah, you can, and depends on the deer density, the population density in your area, whether that'll actually work or not. I would not consider that a foolproof method by any means. So I would just, I think if you want the full range of plants, I would encourage people to either do a full property deer fence as a way to keep deer out, or to embrace individual fencing and tree tubes until your plants are mature, and that'll let you plant whatever you want.
And related to that, would using Arborvitae in a hedge where deer browse is heavy, would that be a problem?
Gosh, well, Curtis could speak more to that than me, but I know that there's a lot of different genetic diversity in Thuya species, and deer like some of them more and others of them less. I know people love the green giant; it's very popular, and partly because it's more deer resistant. But in terms of keeping them out, man, you've seen there are bucks with full racks that crawl under spaces like a foot high. So I wouldn't count on it.
Relating to the question of expanding beds, Mary Jo asked if, mentioning that they have a really diverse hedgerow, and if they wanted to expand the bed, would using cardboard and mulch be a good way to keep woody weeds in check?
Yeah, I'll probably take that one. You're better off if you're going to expand the bed, just use mulch. I've seen the people use the cardboard before. Sometimes that can create an impermeable layer for the water to get in, because it will just have a tendency to wash it off. So I would kind of stay away from the cardboard and just use mulch.
And I'll just add that if you're using cardboard, what you want to make sure you do is you fully saturate it with water as you lay it down. So the easiest way to do that is to use a kiddie pool. So you fill up a kiddie pool and you soak all the cardboard in the kiddie pool and you lay it down sopping wet. And that helps reduce some of that impermeable water shedding effect that Curtis is talking about.
And Randy asked if we should try and encourage more of our perennials to grow rather than cut them back to provide food and shelter for insects. And so with that, like, what are your recommendations for pruning, what to leave, if you're going to leave things standing over the winter? How do you decide your management strategies for that?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that one. Yeah, so The only reason why that we recommend cutting them in the fall is to not have that diversity. And so that's a great thing to do, is to leave it, because then you'll have more diversity over the winter going into the winter, because winters are milder here, and then cut them down early in the springtime, because then you'll get also the winter plumage and the winter look of it too, because perennials, especially grasses, when they go dormant, when the wind's blowing on that, that's another thing that you can get the beauty of that. So that's a great question. Yes, I would say if you like it, leave it until the spring and then cut it down early spring.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think this is part of the question, but there's all this insect dormancy inside those stems, and especially the herbaceous flower stems that stay over the winter. So the other thing is that when you're doing tree weeding, which again is one of the major management issues with some of these kinds of plantings, when you're removing woody plants that have seeded in, if you're clipping them, you don't want to do that in the winter anyway, because that's a growth provoking cut. That's like a pruning cut on a fruit tree. You want to do, if you're clipping, you want to do it in the summer. You want to do it in the late spring and early summer, which is when most of their calories and sugars are above ground. If you're pulling, you can do that in the winter, but obviously not when the ground's frozen. So, I concur with what Curtis is saying there.
I'd like to switch topics a little bit. There are a few questions about insects, pollinators, and in particular, there's a few questions about, plant species or hedge, systems that we would try and implement to protect from light pollution and to sort of create a habitat for nocturnal animals.
Yeah, well, the way to deal with light pollution is to turn the lights off. For the most part, you're gonna need some pretty big trees otherwise. But yeah, no, what Renee just said is, Renee is totally right. The way we know that nighttime lights kill insects is because farmers use it as a pesticide alternative, right? They run big lights at night to reduce their insect population. So that's a pretty strong indicator. But a lot of the times, that is a neighborhood scale issue. So I would actually say that's an organizing question, often more than an individual house. And of course, you can turn off your motion lights and do things on that level. But if you want darker skies, it usually involves organizing.
And as far as some of these, for privacy plantings, someone asked if oak leaf hydrangea would be a good choice for creating privacy.
That may not be big enough for what you want to get for that. You'd probably want to get something bigger than that.
And along that line, some folks are asking about native shrubs. In particular, what would you recommend as a replacement for a current boxwood hedge? They are, this is from Elizabeth, they're on a busy corner lot in Springfield, and they've had traffic accidents entering their yard, damaging their hedges. Can you recommend anything that might be good for a busy urban area?
Yeah, so the PGM rhododendron is a good one for that. That's a hybrid between a rhododendron and an azalea. So that would be good. Azaleas would be another one. Rhododendrons themselves would be, some good ones for something like that.
I'll also just say that the biggest question, if you're trying to replace something, is how important is it to you that it looks exactly like what you're replacing? If you're willing for it to look different, you have so many more options. But if you're committed to it looking the same, you may not even be able to get it to look the same and use a native species. So again, the stretching of our tolerance for what things look like is a big part of enabling the landscape to be higher quality habitat.
And another consideration that often comes to mind when planting along roads would be salts. And a couple of questions came in. If you have recommendations for salt tolerant species and planting methods. For example, should you plant a separate strip near the street if you live in an urban area as like a buffer for salt, especially if you're trying to grow fruiting plants for food? Do you have thoughts about that?
So I would probably make a buffer of perennial plantings first as kind of a line of defense, because those are going to be dormant during the winter. And then I've noticed that either black pine or Austrian pine are more salt tolerant than others. Of course, barberry is, but we don't want to promote planting that anymore. That's kind of off of the list, but that was something that was more hardy. And those two plants that I just suggested were trees anyways. So the other thing to do would be is to put a barrier behind that of a burlap, like a burlap fence, in between your traditional planting and the perennial planting, and that will kind of block the salt the salt from going onto the plants, just as a suggestion. Rosa rugosa is another great plant to put for a buffer in between the two. So you could put that instead of the perennial planting there. They'll stand up to almost anything.
Mm-hmm.
Broadly, I mean, someone said it in the chat, it's an ecological mimic situation. You're looking for salt tolerant things that basically grow in dune ecosystems. So, you know, go to Plum Island and walk around and see what's growing wild is one way to think about that.
Good point.
Mm-hmm. And another, coming back a little bit to the management question, do you encourage people to, you know, in maintaining their yards and lawns to, you know, use like certain practices like leaving your leaves and that sort of thing? What do you recommend to also provide habitat for insects there?
Yeah, if you can tolerate it, but you would want to take it off your lawn, so you could rake them into the beds. Of course, that's the idea of what leaves are supposed to be. Leaves are supposed to be a mulch instead of mulch, but most people won't tolerate it. So if you can tolerate it at the end of the year, blow your leaves into your beds and so forth. But it's too much. You don't want to smother your plants too. But you know, as a general rule, the leaves are supposed to break down from year to year. That was the idea in a forest. When leaves fall, they're food for next year, right? So, but it's a matter of, can you tolerate it? And so I would suggest to, you know, take a portion of that into your bed, but don't put too much. You're still going to have to remove some of it.
Yeah, I'm a pretty big fan of just not raking or blowing. Just leave it. I mean, there's very little, you know, from an ecological and nutrient cycling and insect habitat point of view, there's basically no reason to rake. You know, you'll be able to notice when woody plants are seeding in, and those are removed easily during the growing season.
Great. Well, we're nearing our cutoff time. I think maybe if you would like to answer one final sort of question, or hear a little bit about some of your favorite resources. There have been some added to the chat, but do you have any particular places you go to find plants that fit into your systems?
I guess I'll go first with Western nurseries. Northeast nursery would be the two that I grab from.
I'm going to answer the question in a little bit of a different way, which is about this ecosystem mimic topic. So I really recommend walking around in the wild landscapes near where you live and observing who's growing together, and especially observing who's growing together in similar habitat types to where you are seeking to plant. But the other thing to remember is we have a lot of recombinant ecosystems creating themselves. And, you know, if we are unhappy about the introduced species that we have, and you know, I certainly often am, the bad news is that we've only seen a tiny fraction of what's coming. So there's an enormous amount of ecological movement coming in our lifetimes. And some of those are going to form recombinant symbioses that we can't anticipate yet. So it's valuable to have a curiosity about who's naturalizing, you know, and what are some of the new ecological relationships forming. You see this a lot in cities where there's whole new assemblages forming that we've never seen before. But you can also find some really amazing kind of locally unique genetics that have established themselves in a lot of places, including like remnant communities of native species. So just do a lot of poking around. And if you want to get to some weird places in your neighborhood, follow a skunk around at night. There's a distance they'll let you walk behind them. You'll be able to tell because they'll raise their tail if you get any closer than that distance, but they'll let you walk at this certain distance and they'll lead you to the wildest places. So that's my recommendation. Follow skunks around.
Well, for all of you who are brave enough to go out there and follow skunks around, I applaud you for that. I just want to say it's coming up on 8:30 and I want to respect everyone's time. So thank you everyone for your participation tonight. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you, Connor, for all of that great insight and for information. We would love your feedback. There is a survey that I'm going to drop right here into the chat for you, as well as I'll send it out in a follow-up email. We would love for you to give us your feedback as well. If you found this event inspiring, insightful, please consider making a donation or becoming a NOFAMAS member. As well, we have lots of events coming up. Next week, we begin our Resilient Garden series, where we'll be hosting Allison Houghton, Ruth Green, and Christy Higginbottom, who will be presenting about designing an abundant garden. As well, Ruth Green will be presenting on March 30th about more about the perennial edibles for our gardens and hedgerows. So if you had a question about some of the edible species, fruit-bearing plants, come back on March 30th. We'll talk to Ruth Green more about those perennial edibles for our gardens and hedgerows. As well, this fall we'll be hosting a planting demonstration here, most likely in Beverly or the area in Essex County. That will be specifically about planting a diversified hedgerow. That date's still to be determined, so stay tuned for more information about that. As well, we're gearing up for our 2021 hybrid summer conference in August, so stay tuned for more information about that. And I just want to thank again New England Biolabs Foundation for their grant support. And from everyone at NOFAMAS, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.